Removing Barriers is a four-part series that seeks to inform and inspire people of faith to understand the fight against racism. With an historical perspective coupled with personal witness and experience, the guests share their insights into the very prejudice that has plagued the nation and the world. Your program host is Father Jim Korda, president of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown.
Hello and welcome to our show, Removing Barriers. I'm Father Jim Korda. With me is Bishop George Murry, who is the chair of the Bishop's Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism. Welcome.
Happy to be with you, Father.
In this segment, I think we'd like to tackle some difficult issues. When we talk about racism, we also have to look at certain ideologies. There are certain groups of people whose ideology is totally racist. Why is it important for us to talk about that? For example, white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan. Why is it important for us to at least address those issues and ideologies when we talk about racism?
It's important because of the fact that we have to bring out into the light what is often done in darkness, so that everyone can see what are these groups really saying. Sometimes these groups try to present themselves as we're only protecting our constituents or protecting the people that in our neighborhoods. It's much more than that. There is an ideology that drives white supremacist ideas that if you can just go on the internet, you can look this up and look at various groups. They talk about how white people in the United States are superior to everybody, and that white people in the United States therefore have a right to everything that is the United States. And they make it very clear that anyone who is not white has no rights, has no reason to exist. It gets that serious. Neo-Nazis. We saw that in Charlottesville, marching past a Jewish synagogue, and the synagogue having hired guards to protect the building. Neo-Nazis see absolutely no value in the lives of Jewish people. And these groups, whether they are white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or any other group, any group that does not recognize or refuses to recognize the value of every human being is not Christian. And yet, many of these groups will pride themselves and brag about how Christian they are. This is what they say, and what they do is clearly contrary to the gospel.
And it is totally. How could one be Christian and espouse Jesus as their Lord and Savior, an example of Christian life, and yet have this total ideology that completely debases certain parts of humanity?
Yes.
Let's go back to that whole sense of supremacy. You had mentioned about bringing it out into the light. Why are people more comfortable in the shadows and in the darkness than in the bright light of truth?
Back in August, when the president of the Bishops' Conference asked me to be the chair of this committee against racism, I was doing an interview, and the person conducting the interview said to me, "Why do we need to talk about this in public? Why can't we talk about this in quiet, in back rooms and all of that?" And the person was not saying we shouldn't talk about it. The person was simply saying, this is a difficult topic. Many people don't feel comfortable talking about it. Can't we talk about it in a more private way? My response to her is the same as my response in terms of why we need to bring this out into the light. It's because the results of racist attitudes are not private. They are very public. When a Hispanic child is walking through a neighborhood to go to school and has to endure catcalls from people sitting on their porches because she is Hispanic, that is very public. when that woman was killed in Charlottesville, who was there to call for racial justice. That was a public act. When in situations that we've seen across our country, where there have been these clashes between various white supremacist groups and others, and people have walked away bloody, that's public. What we have to do is bring what is done in the darkness out into the light. The scriptures tell us that, because the light burns away all the excuses and all of the attempts to avoid the truth. The truth of the matter is that we are all created by God and loved by God. Racism denies that. And if we allow racism to continue in the shadows, then we promote it. By bringing it out into the light, we challenge racists to look at themselves and look at others and see where they are similar and where they are different.
In our last few minutes of our time together, we know that for every wrong deed, there are consequences.
Yes.
So what would be some of the consequences or punishments for racism? Does that make sense?
I think if I understand you correctly, the consequences of racism are the consequences of sin. Racism is a sin, and it is a sin that when we behave in that way, we need to take that seriously as a serious sin, and we need to take that to the sacrament of penance and ask God's forgiveness. So we are all going to stand before the Lord and be judged. And the Lord reads our hearts. If we have racist ideas in our hearts, the Lord then will hold us accountable for that.
How do we latch on to that hopefulness in all of this? Will racism disappear? Will prejudice disappear? Will discrimination disappear because of our efforts? Will it lessen? Will it lighten the load? How do we go about bringing that change and addressing that sin of racism?
Well, that's exactly what the Committee Against Racism is working on. We do not want to issue statements. We want to bring people together to understand how racism rears its ugly head in different contexts, and then help people to begin a conversation so that they can move beyond stereotypes and preconceived notions and come to understand each other and respect each other. I have great hope for the youth of our country, because I see in them, when I visit our schools and talk to young people, I see in them a desire to not allow this stain on the American experience to spread. And I see in talking to many older people a realization that we haven't done enough. Bringing that together, I think we can conquer this problem.
Bishop George Murry, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Leigh Greene. Welcome back to our show.
Thank you very much. I'm enjoying sitting and discussing with you.
I think what we'd like to focus on now is to take a look at the criminal justice system. And I know in a short period of time that might not be an easy thing to do. But let's look at that in light of this sense of racism as an evil, as something we need to work through, and how do we do that using the criminal justice system? Is it been for us or against us in that whole area of racism?
I believe that the criminal justice system will have to understand the community that they serve, and that goes through a process again of, just not only being able to do your job, but understanding how you can be beneficial to the environment or the community that you serve. I really believe in the school to prison pipeline, as have been identified by several individuals, and that maybe we are not necessarily doing the best that we can do to eliminate that whole system.
And I think when we look at the system, because of any institution, there are flaws, there are imperfections. But what would be my role as a citizen in addressing the issues within the criminal justice system? Do I have a say? Do I have any input? And if so, how do I do that?
I guess the most important thing, the first thing you can do is vote. So that is imperative. Our heritage of individuals have fought for us to be able to have that right to vote. And I think that every individual should exercise that, so that if you see someone who is in that position of power, that you have that voice, that you can remove that person. So voting, and then also taking part in your city government, attending council meetings, going to courts and sitting and observing how the whole process is, and if you believe that that was fair justice or not. So just sitting and watching and observing and being part of the process, and you can identify what's going on.
It's important that you mention that, because so often we tend to be a kind of couch people that just sit there and vocalize our concerns or angers, but it really is not productive. And so doing it in a more productive way really would help in the long run.
Oh, I agree totally. It's very easy to sit back and point at all the ills in this society in home and living room, sitting there comfortably, but to actually get up and be part of change takes great courage on yourself, but it speaks volumes to making differences.
And let's talk about the whole education system, because that is really an important facet of our communities. And how do we address those issues within the educational systems, especially of prejudice and segregation?
I understand that a lot of what is happening is probably based on financial difficulties and the way schools are funded and so forth. And I'm sure that is probably one of the major excuses for why certain things are happening. But if you are in an area where there is segregation, you as a community can be part of that education process, and you can require more than what is being done. So your voice is very imperative to what is happening in that school district. So even being part of a parents group, or the churches or the parishes taking part in what's going on in your local areas, and being involved that way will really erect change. It might not come from the government so much as far as the finances and the funding, but you can actually have voice of what happens in that school district.
You know, it really is important because as I look at my experience, past experience in education, how important it was for parents and guardians and grandparents to be involved in the lives of their children, because without that involvement, they don't have a voice.
Oh, it's imperative that you know what is going on with your children and have that involvement. With my children, I was part of the parent association and taking part in the activities and knowing what's going on in the school and making that connection with the teachers and the powers that be, and getting to know those individuals so that you can make an understanding and be that connection with your child and that teacher.
Let's, in our last few minutes, talk about the whole idea of the entertainment and media industry. We won't have a lot of time to do that, but let's maybe segue into social media and how that is used for better or for worse in response to the sin of racism.
Oh, well, now that we've gone into social media, I see so much negative, but in turn, there is a way of getting a positive message out there as well. Social media can be very disheartening if you're looking at some of the things that are going back and forth as far as racism and name calling and just the divide. It is just disheartening. But then there are people who are actually taking initiative and making change, and they are putting their programs and their thoughts out on social media as well. So there is that push, but I think that social media has really embraced the negativity of what's going on in our world right now. It's unfortunate, but I guess I am an optimist, and I do believe that we can make change. I don't think that this is going to be the defining moment of America. I hope not.
Well, Leigh Greene, I think it's your optimism that we all need to have and participate in and to embrace, because that is what's going to help move us on and not encourage us to take steps back.
Exactly.
So thank you for your participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
Their numbers are growing. More and more. More than a year ago. More than a decade ago. More people now living in this state than nearly any state in the Union. 1 out of every 8 people in America. 1 out of every 10 families in America. 1 out of every 6 children in America. 33 million Americans struggling just to remain standing. 33 million Americans teetering on the brink of hunger, sickness, hardship, uncertainty. 33 million Americans in these United States descending into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
That's Mary.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
Welcome back. Joining me is Father Ed Noga. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
I think to continue our discussion, we'd like to look at some of the many ramifications of racism in our society, in our communities. And one of the areas that we look at is some of those political ramifications. Not that you and I are in politics, but we come very close to all of that. So what are those ramifications when we're talking about racism and bias and prejudice in the political sphere?
Well, I think sometimes as I look in our community about the breakdown of how people vote, sometimes the lifting up of particular candidates and the people that voted for them kind of pigeonholes us, and I think there is a place for that in the study of demographics, but I think sometimes that kind of divides us a little bit and says, oh, well, if you're of this race or culture, you should be voting for that candidate. Now, I know that seems really simplistic, but I think that kind of happens sometimes. And then I think we forget about what a person stands for or what they'd like to see happen. We just look at their background, and that's just one small part of voting. But in communities, I think especially in urban centers, that seems to happen quite a bit. Sometimes there's that notion of, I hate to say it, we're all sinners and that, but people say, well, it's our turn. Your group had your turn, it's our turn. It's like maybe our turn should be a little broader than just one person, one culture, or one race.
We know that there's many economic ramifications to this prejudice and bias and racism that we experience and that others experience even more tremendously. What are some of those economic ramifications, and why is there such disparity?
Yeah, the disparity is certainly sad as we travel to different neighborhoods, and oftentimes the lending procedures, are lifted up. Well, that's the problem. Everybody likes to point the finger, but it sometimes almost seems contrived, even though I would hope that people aren't sitting in the back room doing that, but it seems that the availability for fixing up homes, for getting homes of different neighborhoods is kind of lined one way or the other, and it certainly doesn't help to make our communities more homogeneous, I don't think.
One of the areas that I'd like us to talk about for a few minutes is that whole area of violence, in particular physical violence. We see it happening in our inner cities, we see it happening in schools, we see it happening in other institutions. Why is it so wrong? And when it's coupled with racism, why does it make it even worse?
Well, I think there's a lot of blaming, especially in some of the larger districts and urban areas of our country where people are easy to say, can't believe it, they're not taking care of themselves or their own people. I don't care who it is, Hispanic, black, poor whites, people who live in the suburbs, whatever. And as soon as we start pointing that finger, and again admitting that we're all sinners, but when we start doing that, we're really eliminating the possibility of looking at a broader picture. I think the church's stand on life issues in general, folds into this whole notion of it's all this violence issue is all part of this. It's not just some of the classic examples of pro-life issues in our church, but it's that respect for human beings to be able to grow, to prosper, to be the people we're called to be. And I'm not just trying to sound pious or anything, it's the truth. It's something we count on, especially in this nation, but it's severely held back, I think, by some of the stereotypes that say, well, this part of the community or that group is causing more problems than another.
And how important is it for people of faith to respond to those things? Why is it part of who we are and our way of life, that we really need to not only take a stand, but to be very vocal about that?
Well, I think it's premier. I think that when we look into the Gospels and see Jesus always inviting people, now granted, he lived in a different part of the world in a different time, but we don't ever see him in any way excluding others, even those who were the notorious public sinners. You know, he wasn't condoning what they did, but he was talking about the person, the heart, and the soul. So if we don't lift that up and speak for that, then I think our messages and our sermons and our homilies are going to be real shallow and hollow, because it has to be for everyone, and we have to speak that way.
You know, it reminds me of that whole put your money where your mouth is kind of thing, and practice what you preach. That's difficult at times. And what can we do to kind of make it not so troubling for us to do that, to say the right thing and to do the right thing?
Well, I think there's a lot of advocacy groups within the church and in communities that try to sift through the issues and really try to come up with practical solutions to real problems. And faith-based organizing in many communities does that, and there's a lot of other just social groups that really try to look beyond what we sometimes just see on the surface. And I think if it takes time and energy, and everybody says they're too busy, but if we take that time, I think in my experience, limited as it is, that we find some solutions that can really work to enable people to, in a sense, in the American phraseology, get ahead. And I don't just mean monetarily, but to have a better social fabric.
Let's kind of close these last few minutes together on that whole social awareness and those social ramifications that are really part of this issue. What can we do collectively to address this whole issue of racism?
Well, I think nationally our bishops will put forth just not letters, but there's national programs and collections that try to keep pushing us to look beyond our own small sphere. And I think we may not be able to be a part of all of those, but I think when they're lifted up at different times of the year, they kind of remind us, hey, you know, we have saints in the church, we have history in the church that has worked on these issues before, and we have to continue. Some of the issues of 500 years ago may have a different name now, but they're still there. They're still there, and they still need to be worked on. So I think the committees in churches like evangelization committees and social justice committees and diocesan pastoral councils and priest councils and that have to keep lifting that up for us. Otherwise, people are going to think it's too big of a problem. There's nothing I can do. That's not true.
Father Noga, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Removing Barriers was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Korda.